Brothers and sisters, I, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to live in a manner worthy of the call you have received. It's interesting, as Paul's speaking today in our first letter today from the Ephesians, he mentions this call that we have received and to live in a manner worthy of that call that we have received. And if we think about that for a moment, we realize, what call have I been? What is the calling that we have received? Well, we know from our very baptism, we are called to holiness. We are called to be sons and daughters of the Father. And that's an amazing call. That's not something to be grudgingly, endure, but like to think about that He's calling us to holiness. He's calling us to sanctity. He's calling us to become saints. And so many times in our world, I think there can be the kind of a ho-hum or humdrum sort of, gosh, I gotta live my faith. But no, He's calling us to something phenomenal. He's calling us to live in His grace and to become saints. Now, that's not easy, and that's, I think, why at times we can kind of lose that zeal, or we can lose that drive, or even lose that enthusiasm sometimes, because we recognize our own limitations and our limitedness and our brokenness. We recognize that, gosh, I'm such a work in progress, but that is not a limitation for Him. It's not. He's not limited by our limitations. He's the infinite one. And what we think is impossible to change in our lives or to make better in our lives is so easy for Him, but it requires faith. It requires us trusting and believing and turning to Him. We see, again, as St. Paul says, I urge you to live in a manner of the call you have received. Now, if we're called to live in holiness, if we're called to heaven, to become saints, if we're called to become like Jesus in every way, then He tells us to live in humility, and gentleness, and patience. And in fact, Paul says it in other places, to live in the love of God, to imitate Him. That's ultimately living the call, living to our full potential, which is to become saints. And so today, as we just think about that, we have been called to become saints. We have been called to holiness. We have been called to recognize the real dignity of being sons and daughters of the Father. How often do we think about that? How often do we ponder and reflect about our real dignity, about our true dignity, not in what the world is giving or saying we have or don't have, but what He has bestowed upon us? It's so easy for us to, I think, overlook the great call that God has given to each one of us, starting again with our very baptism. So may we ask for that grace. May we ask for that grace to see our true dignity, our true call to holiness and to become saints. And may we ask Him for that grace to live it, and to be open to that conversion that He still wants to work in us. He still wants to shape and prune and mold our hearts to become more and more like Jesus. That's it. That's the Christian life, is becoming more and more like Jesus. Our hearts being molded and trimmed and pruned and shaped. Sometimes that's painful at times. But He's wanting us to imitate Him. He's wanting us to become exactly like Him. And we see that coming to total fruition ultimately in heaven. So may God give us that grace to not lose hope, to be courageous, to be joyful in this beautiful call to holiness and the kingdom of heaven.